Good morning to Unify Pain. Thanks to the Anti-Alienation Project as usual, thanks to those standing up against the abuse of children and the rights for fathers, mothers and family. We're going to be listening to a talk from Dr. Vernon Coleman today about the state of our medical profession, or whatever he decides to call it. But the reason we accept our ongoing reality is now is primarily concerned with the multifaceted, multi-layered control system set in place by for-profit big business that has purchased our own sellout governments, courts, police, judges, lawyers, you name it. These big business billionaire boys have been abusing, and now they've purchased those they set to abuse us. How is this even a possibility? Based on years of knowledge, magic and control that has been suppressed to an extent. The reason I say to an extent is because the knowledge, although hidden, it is in plain sight. It's in all the movies referring to the mad control. The vast majority are just under this mind control. We say they're asleep. We say they don't understand. Some choose to keep quiet. And I have often spoke about the control networks keeping supposed men and fathers quiet. This again is done by bombarding the vast majority operating within the control network. And we know this is Hollywood, MTV, the Freemasonic Order of the Eastern Star. Like, it's the same thing. It's Luciferian, devil worshipping, child abusing. Have you noticed that all of the respective country leaders are of an intelligence that you don't quite see a prime minister to have, or someone to run a country? I talk about this quite often with post-turtles and the SMPs and MPs that are in our Scottish government. We know a turtle can't climb a fence post, so we know most of these Luciferian fake leaders have been placed there. And they've been placed there by the control network and men at the top. This is beyond unacceptable. In this position, they are no more than lost animals. Yet the vast majority still listen to these people. So we've shown that the corruption is within our courts here, and the corruption, especially in Gorzów-Wielkopolski, the prosecutors, the police, this system is what we still would consider Nazi, but they get away with it through their American system, and we've proven with using their legalese system that they're abusing kids, and all they do is ignore it. We can show using their own law that they are corrupt. So where can a father turn? Where can a mother turn to when their children is being abused by the other parent? I used to think the medical establishment, I used to think any of these people would help. Now I wonder if Dr. Vernon Coleman could explain some historical information regarding this big business, this network of billionaires which has taken over, which owns our government, and we don't yet get to see. And we know there is this one world government. They let us know. But let's hear a little more from Dr. Vernon Coleman.
Is often a little better than it was in a hospital. Over the years, the medical establishment has acquired a well-deserved reputation for ignoring good discoveries which would make a dramatic difference to human health, and continuing with useless practices which do more harm than good, long after they should have abandoned them. The medical profession, or rather I should say the medical establishment, has always been slow to accept and assimilate new ideas, and slow to see the obvious. I've long thought that the main problem with modern medical education is that it's largely based upon learning by rote and upon eliminating all original thought. This is deliberate, since the aim of an orthodox modern medical education is to help maintain the status quo and preserve the position of the pharmaceutical industry. Right from the very beginning, young students are made to learn long lists of information. They learn the names of the bones, the arteries, the nerves, and the veins in the body. They learn the names of the muscles, and they learn a histology of the various organs. They then learn lists of clinical signs and symptoms, and they learn lists of drugs. At no point are students encouraged to think for themselves. As a result, it's not surprising that after graduation, most doctors continue to do as they are told. The average doctor is strangely incapable of critical thought. Given the indoctrination they've undergone, it's hardly surprising that doctors readily accept everything they're told by the drug companies, which more or less control postgraduate education, and equally readily reject alternative medicine, something which never makes much of an appearance in the undergraduate syllabus. There's nothing new about this. The greatest thinkers, the ones who have, in the end, contributed most to medicine and human health, have always been scorned or ignored, or preferably both, by the medical establishment. The establishment has always maintained the truth to suit its own political, religious, or commercial purposes. Simple truths, which are inconvenient, have always been suppressed. It happened in the past, and it will happen in the future, and it's happening now. Few medical stories illustrate the way the medical establishment works better than the story of how scurvy was discovered and how the treatment for it was ignored for centuries. In 1535, Jacques Cartier sailed from France to Newfoundland with a crew of 110 men. Within 6 weeks, 100 of his men had developed scurvy. Luckily for Cartier and his men, a native told them to drink the juice from the fruit of one of the local trees. The men recovered in days. From that time on, wise sea captains made sure that their men were given regular supplies of orange or lemon juice. In a book called The Surgeon's Mate, published in 1636, John Woodall recommended that these juices be used to prevent scurvy. But the medical establishment was slow to accept this sensible suggestion. It wasn't until 2 centuries after Cartier, in 1747, that the idea was reintroduced by James Lind, who conducted a proper clinical trial and proved that scurvy could be prevented with the right diet. It was Lind's work which enabled Captain Cook, who was a lieutenant at the time, to sail around the world without a single case of scurvy. But the Admiralty and the medical establishment continued to ignore this. In the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, approximately half of the 185,000 sailors involved died of scurvy. In 1779, the Channel Fleet had 2,400 cases of scurvy after a single 10-week cruise. Eventually, in 1795, the medical establishment and the Navy succumbed to common sense, and lemon juice became a compulsory part of every sailor's diet. This breakthrough had taken well over 2 centuries to be accepted. Then there's Paracelsus. There's no doubt that Paracelsus, Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim to his friends, is the father of modern medicine. He tore into the precepts of established medical thinking with all the zeal of a missionary. He revolutionized medical thinking throughout Europe and scandalized the medical establishment by claiming to have learned more from his contact with witches and midwives than from his study of ancient and well-revered medical texts. No idea or theory was too bizarre to be studied and considered, and no belief, no practice, and no concept too sacred to be rejected. He was the first man to associate mining with chest disease, to use mercury in the treatment of syphilis, to advocate allowing wounds to drain instead of smothering them with layers of dry dung, and to argue that some foods contained poisons which harm the human body. Paracelsus scandalized the establishment by claiming that he was interested more in pleasing the sick than his own profession. He was, not surprisingly, rejected by the medical establishment and widely and persistently persecuted for his beliefs. It was years after his death that his ideas were recognised. And then there's Vesalius. In the 16th century, Andreas Vesalius achieved contemporary notoriety and eternal fame as the author of the first textbook of human anatomy. Up until Vesalius, medical students had studied anatomy using texts prepared by Galen. Since Galen used pigs, not human corpses, for his studies, his anatomical notes were, to say the least, rather misleading. Vesalius's frank rejection of many of Galen's anatomical claims earned him considerable disapproval. The medical establishment still firmly believed that Galen could do no wrong. They weren't interested in anything as superficial and irrelevant as evidence. Like so many original thinkers before and after him, Vesalius was unable to cope with the outcry. He burnt his remaining manuscripts, abandoned his study of anatomy, and took a job as court physician to Charles V in Madrid. Vesalius wasn't the only anatomist whose work was rejected. In the 17th century, British doctor William Harvey spent 8 years researching the circulation of the blood and getting it right. His patience was rewarded with ridicule. He received nothing but abuse. He lost many friends and his practice shrank. When Ambrose Paré, the great French surgeon, first started work as an army surgeon, it was accepted practice to stop a hemorrhage by sealing a wound with a red-hot iron. Amputations were performed with a red-hot knife, and the wounds which were left were sealed with boiling oil. One day Paré ran out of boiling oil and used a mild emollient to dress the wounds of the men he was treating. He worried all night about what he'd done, but the next day he found that his patients were not only healthy, but that they were also in less pain than the men whose wounds had been sealed with boiling oil. Paré was wise enough to learn from this, and from that day on he started dressing wounds with an emollient rather than boiling oil. He also introduced ligatures, artificial limbs, and many surgical instruments. Inevitably, Paré met the usual fate of innovators and reformers, who get a rougher ride within the world of medicine than anywhere else. He was denounced by other surgeons as dangerous and unprofessional. Older surgeons banded together to oppose him, and in their attempts to discredit him, they attacked him for all sorts of things, for example, his ignorance of Latin and Greek. Paré eventually succeeded because the soldiers he treated trusted him and wanted to be treated by him. They weren't interested in the views of the French medical establishment. A look back at hospitals is also revealing. When Tsar Paul came to power in Russia in 1796, he was so horrified at the state of the hospital in Moscow that he ordered it to be rebuilt. In Frankfurt, in the 18th century, physicians considered working in hospital to be the equivalent of a sentence of death. In 1788, Jacobus René Tenon published a report on the hospitals of Paris which shocked city officials. He described how the Hôtel Dieu, the magnificent-looking hospital still there next to Notre Dame, contained 1,200 beds but up to 7,000 patients, with up to 6 patients crammed into each bed. The stench in the hospital was so foul that people who entered would do so holding a vinegar-soaked sponge to their noses. Very few patients escaped from the hospital with their lives. When reformer John Howard toured European hospitals, he angrily reported that no fresh air, no sunlight, straw as bedding, no bandages, and a milk and water diet supplemented with weak soup were standard. The reports of Tenon and Howard were ignored and dismissed for years, and it took decades for the medical establishment to make any real changes. There
seems to be a pattern. When these great doctors, physicians, find a cure, and even the high level of vitamin C for scurvy, for us not to be using high level vitamin C for basic infections and for many other treatments is beyond me. Now, when I've studied about biochemist Dr. Johanna Budwig, I find the same thing. She saves the lives of thousands of stage 4 cancer victims. The hospital in Germany had given up on the patients, and she took them into her self-made clinic and gave them sunlight, a healthy diet of linseed oil and cottage cheese, yes, and linseeds, and she took them out for walks. Over 90% of those stage 4 cancer men and women that were set to die and left to die by the medical establishment, and we know it's not just the UK, Germany or Europe or America, it's all over. It's one group, it's one mind, and it's one hive mind making decisions which are wrong and not in the interests of people lying in bed in hospitals. We've seen this with tuberculosis before the cancer, and now we're seeing it with dementia. You're not told the basics with dementia would be that nicotine can help. Nicotine can help in heart attacks. Linseed oil and cottage cheese protect and save the lives of over 90%. And I can't tell you if it's hundreds of thousands or millions of women that have been through this, but I can tell you I've seen this with a dozen women at least, personally. So I don't think this works. I know this works time after time after time. And those who it doesn't work for, they can't change their diet. They've got a too childlike mind, and they need sweeties, they need bread and sandwiches, they need pasta and sauces, they need what the junk food manufacturers produce, which causes cancer and causes all of these illnesses. Now, this channel is primarily for the safety of fathers, mothers, and more importantly, the 100% of children that are abused when psychological abuse takes place by a mother or father. I'm hoping that some people out there who have these sicknesses, rather than dismiss something so basic like lemon juice for something so serious like scurvy, or something so serious as cancer, and you won't take something as simple as linseed oil and cottage cheese, you're not adults. You're old, but you're not adults. You're old, but you're not parents. You're old, but you're not mothers or fathers. And they're treating you like old, stupid children. Whenever you step in a courtroom, whenever you step and speak to the police, whenever you step in front of what you call authority in a hospital, in a doctor's office, you turn into a stupid, old child. You've got the option to walk away from those who, for centuries, have been murdering you and your ancestors. You have the opportunity to walk away from them today and look after your own health with the basics that we have. And if you don't want to trust cottage cheese and linseed oil, I understand it. You trust those who are willing to kill you and your parents and children. I can't change your mind if that's what you are. And I'm not looking to change anyone's mind. I'm looking for you to change your mind on your own because you've decided to look into some of this. Believe my words. When evidence is given to show children are being abused, lives are being saved, we don't want to know. I know this because I've given evidence and it's being ignored. It's being ignored by the Gorzów-Wielkopolski Nazi system and the Scottish Nazi system. The abuse of my son and daughter, the abuse by my ex-partner on myself, my son and daughter, they're documented. Her lies are documented. They're documented by the Police Scotland, they're documented. The Police Scotland can tell you the full story. They can tell you exactly what she said to them with the charity Women's Aid. I've already sat down, interviewed a policeman who took the story from these people, and I had to pay to interview that policeman. I had to pay over £100 to interview that policeman. The Gorzów Regional Court has her own admission. I am not a stalker. I am not a rapist. I am not an abusive man. I am not and never have acted criminally and caused any intentional pain, fear or loss to any person. My ex and mother of my children has made false allegations of the most serious nature which ruins lives and has led to the hardcore physiological, psychological abuse of both my son and daughter. This occult practice abuse is well known. False allegations took my children out of my life and the police and the government in Scotland assisted the abuser. That's why they ignore the evidence giving. And I'm sure it's a multifaceted, layered reasoning. The same as Dr. Carol Vernon has explained. They took 200 years to save tens of thousands, if not millions, of lives of sailors. 200 years passed before they accepted the very basic information. Do we need to wait another 150 years to save people with cancer for something non-invasive? Something that will not make you sick? No, we are still feeding people. We are still dressing your wounds with burning hot oil. That's what they're doing with chemotherapy. They're burning your insides till they will not work. Even if you are saved by this chemotherapy, you will not live long. The chemical cocktail that they put into your system destroys your system. Eating linseed oil and cottage cheese actually tastes nice. My ex admitted her allegations of assault, physical, sexual, mental abuse was a story fed to her. It was a story fed to her by a funded Scottish charity. Police Scotland were willing to sit and take in this story from Edinburgh Women's Aid. Police Scotland PCs do not only deny this, but they can provide the evidence of exactly what allegations were made by the scheming child abusing lowlife and the institutional child abusers. The terrorist cell we call Women's Aid, and we still fund to this day. I face a cause of prison, and I will be going across there, and I have been facing this prison for years because of these false allegations. I am not allowed to work in the UK because of these false allegations, and yes, the evidence is there, the same as evidence can sit for 200 years before you even look. Our institutions have been bought because you have sold out. The vast majority have sold out. And the last thing they want to be doing is thinking for themselves. The local authorities hold no authority. The education system has no way to educate your children. The health system makes you sick. The police protect criminals and paedophiles. The courts and judges release murderers and prisoners and child abusing rapists. Do you not see the message that's pretty damn clear and should be heard by you? I'll let Dr. Vernon Coleman speak the rest of his words.
To make any real changes. In the 18th century, the treatment of the mentally ill was abysmal. Daniel Defoe, best remembered for his story of the adventures of Robinson Crusoe, wrote a vicious attack on mental hospitals. Is it not enough to make anyone mad, he asked, to be suddenly clapped up, stripped, whipped, ill-fed, and worst, to have no reason assigned for such treatment, no crime alleged or accusers to confront, and what is worse, no soul to appeal to, but merciless creatures who answer but in laughter, surliness, contradiction, and too often stripes. No one took much notice, and medical practitioners continued to treat mentally ill patients without respect or care. At the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, half-naked patients were kept chained in irons. Physicians bled their patients once a year, and the more troublesome patients were put on a tranquilizing wheel until...
I visited the brother of my the mother of my children. I visited her older brother, Pavel. He was kept in a mental hospital in Gorzów-Wielkopolski. I had never seen a man chained to a hospital bed in a mental hospital before this day. We're speaking, Dr. Coleman speaking about a scenario 200 years ago where this was taking place. This is taking place today. This was taking place while the lockdown was on. I was across in Poland. I visited this man. Now, this is the only man to have ever threatened me using black magic. He threatened me using a little doll and telling me that I was going to suffer based on what he would do to this doll. I know the man, Pavel, the brother of my ex-partner. I know he was abused. And I know when I seen him in hospital, I wasn't allowed to go back and see him again. Because I tell people, I speak about how we treat others. Even if those people are willing to stand against the rights of my children and not see that the women in their family are abusive, and they have pushed Pavel into these positions where he's mentally broken. It's just that I'd never ever expected I would see in a hospital, a mental hospital, someone I know chained to a bed. But in Gorzów-Wielkopolski, it still happens. It still happens, and I know because I've seen it.
Yeah, and the more troublesome patients were put on a tranquilizing wheel. Until 1770, visitors could pay a penny to see the fun at Bedlam. John Wesley, founder of the Wesleyan Church, who considered himself a benefactor of the mentally ill, suggested pouring water onto the heads of the mentally ill and forcing them to eat nothing but apples for a month. Wesley was one of the first men to use electricity in the attempted treatment of the mentally ill. Despite the protests of reformers who shocked the establishment in the late 18th century by claiming that the mentally ill were sick and needed treatment, mental hospitals were, well into the 19th century, still quite unsuitable for people who were ill and needed treatment. There was never any evidence to show that it did any good, but bloodletting was a favourite therapeutic tool for centuries. The fact that removing blood from a patient made him or her quieter was regarded as proof that it was doing some good. This is no dafter than the rationale used to explain some modern treatments. Bloodletting was easy to perform, and it was something to do. Doctors have always felt the need to do something to their patients, possibly because it's difficult to explain away a big fee if all you do is talk. Leeches were hugely popular in the 19th century. In 1824, 2 million leeches were imported into France. In 1832, the figure had risen to 57 million a year. In 1843, the American poet, novelist, and anatomist Oliver Wendell Holmes read to the Boston Society for Medical Improvement a paper entitled On the Contagiousness of Puerperal Fever. He argued that the disease could be carried from patient to patient by doctors. He suggested that surgeons should consider changing their clothes and washing their hands after leaving a patient with puerperal fever. His lecture annoyed the medical establishment, and his advice was ignored completely. A similar fate befell Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, who in 1846, at the age of 28, became an assistant in an obstetric ward at the hospital in Vienna. Semmelweis noticed that the number of women dying in his ward was higher than the number dying in other wards. It wasn't difficult to notice this. Women would beg in tears not to be taken into Semmelweis's ward. Deciding that he wasn't that bad a doctor, Semmelweis looked for an explanation and came to the conclusion that the major difference was that patients on his ward were looked after by medical students, whereas the patients on other wards were looked after by midwives. Semmelweis then discovered that the students came straight to the ward from the dissecting room, where they'd had their hands stuck into the corpses of women who died from puerperal fever. The midwives never went near the dissecting room. Semmelweis instructed the medical students that they should start washing their hands in a solution of calcium chloride after coming from the dissecting room. The remedy produced a dramatic drop in the death rate on his ward. Predictably, However, the medical establishment was not well pleased, even though Semmelweis had proved his point very dramatically. The unfortunate young doctor couldn't cope with the rejection. He became an outcast and died in a mental hospital a few years later. The medical establishment had scored another hollow victory. Once again, patients were the losers. You might have thought that the medical establishment would have welcomed anaesthesia. After all, before anaesthetics were available, surgeons had to get their patients drunk or knock them out with a blow to the head. Surgeons would often operate with the patient held down by four strong men. The first operation under anaesthesia was performed at the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1846.
And believe me, if we could still operate on people by knocking them out, giving them a bang over the head, or getting them drunk, I'm sure we in our medical establishment would still use these methods. Humorism was something that was very important. And this again, which doctors try and explain away the importance of humorism. And humorism itself was beautifully complex. Practitioners are now considered to be right about the fact that dis-ease and injury involve changes to and problems with the many substances in our body that regulate our biology, including the phlegm, the blood and the bile. Now, it said they were just wrong about the mechanics of causality. Humorism was eventually replaced by modern medicine in the mid-19th century. So anything you hear prior to the mid-19th century, this was humorism. Now, we still use much of the techniques prior to 150 years ago, or prior to the mid-19th century. The scientific method, clinical trials, much of the modern medicine, and humorism, much of the medicine used in humorism, it was illegal, it was illegalised and rubbished, and still is rubbished today. Even with evidence, even with lives being lost, even with major illnesses and pharmaceutical companies looking to get trials on different diseases like cancers and that ruin lives, young lives. We won't try and take a non-invasive method of treating our young or old. The scientific establishment have lost their mind, or they're being funded to lose their mind. We need to provide accurate results, as the emphasis right now is on profit, not people. For the longest time, the scientific method led us to believe that the cause of gastric ulcers was stress. Stress, right up until 1984. And it took years after this, because my dad was told it was a Helicobacter bug, when Barry J. Marshall in 1984 signed the bacterium Helicobacter pylori was the root cause. The Helicobacter bug was the root cause of these ulcers, and it wasn't stress. And it only takes a small change in diet. Now, we're still giving people these same diagnoses today. Friends, family are still getting this same diagnosis today, when all it takes is for some fermented milk and good linseed oil or flaxseed. And if that's still a joke to most of you, that is why the medical industry wins. Constantly, time after time, they can poison your own, your family and your children.
Massachusetts General Hospital in 1846, but the establishment was not going to accept this newfangled nonsense lying down. The main objection was that anaesthetics were being used to help women who were in labour, and that, said the establishment, just wasn't acceptable. It was, said the wise men, unnatural and unhealthy for women to deliver babies without suffering pain. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, says the Bible. However, the religious barbarians were eventually overcome by Dr. James Simpson, who trumped the Bible quoters with this quote, "And the good Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof." The opposition to anaesthesia was finally quelled only when Queen Victoria gave birth to Prince Leopold while under the influence of chloroform. In 1867, Joseph Lister published a paper in The Lancet entitled On the Antiseptic Principle in the Practice of Medicine. Lister had found a solution to the age-old problem of post-operative infection. But the medical establishment doesn't like change, even if it means keeping patients alive, and Lister found himself attacked by doctors who ignored the evidence but disapproved of his new techniques simply because they were new. It was decades before the antiseptic principle was accepted. One of the reasons why hospital infections are so common today is that doctors and nurses seem to believe that they can use antibiotics instead of washing their hands. Incompetence, carelessness and ignorance mean that the quality of cleanliness in the average modern hospital is often little better than it was in a hospital in the Middle Ages. Until surprisingly recently, it was routine for surgery on babies to be performed without anaesthesia on the grounds that babies were incapable of feeling pain. There was no evidence for this claim, one which any mother would be able to oppose with credible if anecdotal evidence, but anaesthetists were taught that babies had immature nervous systems and so didn't need painkillers. I have so far described just a few of the hundreds, probably thousands, of examples I could give to illustrate the way that the medical establishment, allied with the early, middle and later pharmaceutical industry, has always opposed original thought and has protected the status quo, regardless of the effect on patients. The medical establishment has, I'm afraid, acted in the interests of the profession, but against the interests of patients. And thoughtful and creative individuals have always had a hard time. The value of serendipity has also been ignored, of course. Both penicillin and X-rays were the result of serendipity. The real tragedy in all this is that absolutely nothing has changed for the better. Indeed, things have arguably got worse. The medical establishment is still responsible for protecting and promoting medical procedures which don't work and have never worked, and which expose patients to great risk, while at the same time it opposes and suppresses treatments which do work and have been proved to work. Today, anyone in the medical profession who dares to offer thoughts or warnings which don't fit in with the specific requirements of the medical establishment will get the Semmelweis treatment. They'll be laughed at and suppressed and demonized. Nothing's changed, as I and others have discovered to our cost. Thank you for watching An Old Man in a Chair.
And it's great to hear the words from the old man in the chair. If this information doesn't make you angry at the police service, the government services, the UK government services, our health services, big business, pharmaceutical companies, you name it, we could go on this with the school services and everyone else, but we abuse and hurt children. We abuse and hurt babies. We make up stories that babies don't feel pain, so men and women willing to abuse, hurt them, cut them open and operate on them. We cause so much pain to our children, and the only way forward is for men to learn to show their children how to live and love. The only way forward for any golden generation is for us to teach our children how to live and love. Of course I'm angry, and you should be too just now. But anyone can be angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy. Aristotle said that. I repeated his words, but only because I know them to be true. They will use your anger and play the victim, and they will have professionals playing the victim who are still willing to abuse. They will fund those playing the victim while children suffer, while the sick suffer, while people go in trusting the hospital facilities, and these people are still using squeezy bacteria to clean their hands, not soap and water. We need to go back to the basics. We need to make sure that we look at our basic foods and we stop poisoning our system using these food manufacturers because they're owned by the pharmaceutical companies, which are owned by big business, which own our governments. They don't want a healthy, happy population. They want a sick and easily controlled population. One day, you will understand that this thing they call parental alienation is terrorism against fathers and mothers, but only good, loving, caring fathers and mothers. You see, in every establishment they run, they never help family, fathers, mothers, but never, ever, ever, ever children. Never children. We won't give them painkillers to stop the pain because we would prefer to make up a story. They don't feel pain. Their central nervous system doesn't work good. You can cut that baby wide open and they don't feel pain. You can abduct and abuse that baby, they don't feel pain. You sick, sick people. We have an opportunity to use our anger in the right way, aim it at the right people, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose. And if that purpose is not to save our children and our society, then I have no reason to understand what it's used for. But we need to do it together. It's terrorism against your children, their hearts, their minds and soul. Ava, Matthew, Daddy loves you. I love you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it's like this. Take care.